The marble corridors of empires often echoed with more than just the sound of sandals and swords. They whispered secrets of forbidden love, lust, and desire that shaped kingdoms and toppled dynasties. Behind every golden throne, behind every polished crown, there lay a private world, one hidden from public view, where emperors indulged in their most primal instincts. Let's begin, not in Rome, nor in China, but in the heart of ancient Egypt, where gods and kings shared the same bed of divinity and sin. Cleopatra and the gods of desire before she was the queen of seduction. Cleopatra was a symbol of divine sensuality. To her people, she wasn't just a ruler. She was the living form of the goddess Isis. The pharaohs of Egypt believed that sex was sacred, an act that could connect them with the gods. So, their royal bedrooms were not just chambers of pleasure, but temples of ritual. Cleopatra mastered this power. She understood that seduction was not a weakness. It was a weapon. Her affairs with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony weren't just love stories. They were acts of political genius. But what few know is that Cleopatra also used secret perfumed oils and exotic aphrodisiacs made from lotus flowers, honey, and crocodile fat. Substances believed to make the body irresistible. Her bath, according to ancient records, was filled with donkey milk, said to preserve eternal youth. Even her voice, ancient writers said, was a musical instrument of desire. The private chambers of Alexandria's palace were designed with hidden pools, scented torches, and silk curtains that moved like waves, spaces where pleasure and politics were intertwined. But Egypt was not alone in this dance of desire. Across the Mediterranean, another empire rose, one that would redefine indulgence itself. Roman Caligula, the emperor of madness and lust. Gaius Caesar, better known as Caligula, ruled Rome for only 4 years, but in those years, he turned the empire into a playground of perversion. Historians say he slept with his sisters, mocked the gods, and turned banquets into orgies. Whether all of it is true or exaggerated propaganda, one thing is certain: Caligula blurred every line between power and pleasure. His palace became an endless festival of vice. He would host feasts where the finest Roman citizens were invited not to dine, but to watch unspeakable acts unfold before them. He demanded that senators offer their wives to him for the night, as a sign of loyalty. For Caligula, domination wasn't just political. It was physical, carnal, and psychological. But perhaps the most shocking part wasn't what he did. It was why he did it. Ancient sources say Caligula believed himself to be a god, so he sought pleasure, not as a man, but as a deity, one who could create and destroy with the same touch. His madness wasn't random. It was the result of unchecked divine power. And when you give a man absolute power over life and death, what is left to crave? Desire. Rome's emperors were not the only ones who turned their thrones into beds of lust. In the East, the Chinese emperors of the Han and Tang dynasties built entire systems around pleasure, the Chinese art of the bedchamber. While the West often treated sexuality as scandal, the ancient Chinese saw it as a science, a philosophy of balance and energy. The emperor's duty was to preserve his vitality, his young, by mastering the art of the bedchamber. But make no mistake, this art wasn't innocent. Emperors had hundreds, sometimes thousands of concubines, carefully chosen for their youth, beauty, and balance of energy. Palace attendants recorded the emperor's nightly schedule with mathematical precision. It wasn't just about pleasure. It was believed that his virility kept the empire strong. One Han emperor was said to have so many concubines that even he could not remember their names. They were divided by rank, trained in the art of seduction, and instructed to please without attachment. The emperor was a godlike figure who could take whoever he desired, but his excess often led to his downfall. One ruler, Emperor Wu of Han, became obsessed with a single concubine named Lady Li. He neglected the state, ignored his ministers, and spent his nights in endless luxury until rebellion spread across his borders. Desire had done what no army could: weaken an empire. From Egypt's sacred seduction to Rome's madness and China's discipline of pleasure, a pattern began to emerge. The most powerful men in history were slaves to their desires. When pleasure became power, what made these emperors different wasn't their lust, it was how they used it. For Cleopatra, sex was strategy. For Caligula, it was domination. For the Chinese emperors, it was immortality. But in every case, the line between sacred and sinful blurred. Ancient courts were filled with whispers, courtesans who ruled from behind curtains, queens who used perfume instead of politics, and emperors who mistook desire for destiny. In one Roman tale, Emperor Nero forced senators to watch his wedding, not to a queen, but to a male slave he dressed as a bride. It wasn't about love. It was about proving that his power was limitless. And as these rulers chased pleasure, their empires began to rot from within. Ministers plotted, generals rebelled, and people starved, while the rulers drowned themselves in luxury. Because when a king begins to think of himself as a god, the fall is never far behind. In the end, behind the gold and glory, the truth was simple. The empire of desire is the most dangerous kingdom of all. The empire had grown silent. Yet the shadow of Caligula's lust still haunted Rome. Power had changed hands, but the sickness of desire remained woven into the marble veins of the palace. The next to sit upon the throne would carry that same hunger, only more refined, more deliberate, and far more dangerous. His name was Nero. Nero had been raised under the careful eyes of his mother Agrippa, a woman as ambitious as any emperor who had ever lived. She believed her son's destiny was to rule Rome, and she would do anything to make that happen. But once Nero claimed the throne, her influence became his greatest humiliation. He wanted to prove that no one, not even the woman who gave him life, could control him, and that desire twisted into something darker. Rumors spread that Nero's obsession with his mother was not merely political. Historians whispered that he was fascinated by her beauty, her control, her sensual power over every man in Rome. Some said he arranged her death only after their relationship had crossed unthinkable boundaries. Others believed he killed her because she had refused to let him rule freely. Whatever the truth, her blood became the first stain on Nero's throne. But death didn't satisfy him. Nero's nights grew stranger. He transformed the imperial palace into a golden labyrinth filled with fountains of wine, naked dancers, and mirrors placed on the ceilings so he could watch himself in moments of ecstasy. He believed he was an artist of pleasure, a performer whose body was the stage. Once, he married a young boy named Sporus, had him castrated, dressed him like a queen, and paraded him as his wife through the streets of Rome. The people watched in stunned silence as their emperor defied not only morality but nature itself. For Nero, the empire was not a kingdom. It was a playground. He would appear on stage, dressed as a god, singing songs of love and lust while Rome burned behind him. And as flames consumed the city, he stood upon a balcony, watching, singing, smiling. To him, destruction was beautiful, another form of creation, while Rome crumbled under Nero's madness. Far across the seas, another empire was rising, one where desire was considered divine, not sinful. In the lands of India, the Mauryan kings ruled with discipline, but behind the walls of their palaces, passion was treated as sacred art. Emperor Chandragupta Maurya had built an empire of order, but his grandson, Ashoka, carried a different fire within him. Before becoming the peaceful Ashoka the Great, he was known as Ashoka the Cruel, a man who had hundreds of concubines and was infamous for his temper. Legends say he once killed 99 of his brothers to secure the throne. Yet among his many pleasures, he found himself obsessed with a woman named Devi. She wasn't royal, not Eva Noble, but her intelligence and beauty consumed him. When Ashoka visited her city, he disguised himself as a merchant just to be near her. Their affair was passionate and secret, hidden behind silken drapes and jasmine's tinted nights. But after years of war, blood, and indulgence, something changed in him. He began to see that the empire he built on desire and death was hollow. And so, after one of the bloodiest battles in Indian history, the Kalinga War, Ashoka turned away from lust and violence, embracing Buddhism and peace. The transformation was astonishing. The same emperor who once drowned himself in women and wine became a monk who preached compassion. But for every king who found redemption, there were others who drowned deeper in darkness. Beyond the Indian plains, in the land of Persia, desire was not just personal, it was political. The Persian kings of the Achaemenid dynasty were masters of excess. Their palaces in Persepolis glittered with gold, but the true treasures lay in the hidden chambers. The royal harems. Hundreds of women from conquered lands were brought to serve the king, chosen for their beauty and trained in the art of pleasure. These women weren't prisoners. They were pawns in a game of influence. A single night with the king could elevate a family's status or destroy it. King Xerxes, known for his campaigns against Greece, was said to be ruled more by his passions than his generals. When he looked upon a woman, he didn't see a subject. He saw a conquest. He once delayed a military campaign for weeks because he was infatuated with the wife of one of his officers. The scandal nearly caused a revolt, but Xerxes didn't care. He believed that a man who ruled the world had the right to possess whatever pleased him. It was this mindset that power justified pleasure that united emperors across centuries and continents. Whether it was Nero in Rome, Ashoka before his enlightenment, or Xerxes in Persia, all were prisoners of the same invisible chain. The throne didn't free them. It enslaved them to their own desires. In the royal courts, whispers grew like vines. Servants carried messages between lovers. Courtesans became spies. Eunuchs controlled access to the bedchambers, deciding who could see the emperor and when. Some used perfume to tempt. Others used poetry. The art of seduction became a weapon sharper than any sword. And yet, in every empire, one truth remained. No matter how powerful the man, there was always a moment when he bowed before desire. Kings who commanded armies trembled at the touch of a woman. Emperors who ordered deaths with a glance would beg for love in the dark. From the burning palaces of Rome to the perfumed harems of Persia, the story was the same. Empires built on lust were destined to fall, because desire, once unchained, could never be ruled. And while Nero's fire turned Rome to ash and Xerxes' heart burned for women more than war, another land far to the east was preparing its own chapter in the empire of seduction, a dynasty where pleasure itself was written into the laws of the court. In China, the emperors of the Tang dynasty were about to prove that even in a land of discipline and order, desire could become the most dangerous force of all. The Tang dynasty was China's golden age, a time of poetry, power, and passion. Cities shimmered with light, merchants carried silk across deserts, and in the heart of it all stood the forbidden city as ancestor. A palace where even the scent of jasmine could mean life or death. The emperors of the Temps were not just rulers. They were gods in human form, and their every desire became a command. Emperor Xuanzong was one of them, a man of immense intelligence, charm, and appetite. His court was filled with music and art, but what people whispered about most was his love for a woman who changed the fate of the dynasty, Yang. She wasn't born a princess or a noble. She was once married to Xuanzong's own son, but when the emperor saw her, he lost himself completely. Her beauty was said to be so divine that flowers would bow when she passed. Xuanzong's obsession with Yang Gufei was more than love. It was worship. He made her the highest-ranked concubine in the empire, showered her with gold, jewels, and palaces. Every morning, he would visit her chambers before attending court. Ministers waited outside as he brushed her hair, listened to her laughter, and let the empire's affairs rot under silk sheets and whispered songs. The royal kitchens were ordered to prepare only the dishes she liked. Musicians composed melodies in her name. Even her relatives gained immense power. Her cousin became a general, her brother a minister, both using her influence to control the empire. But love in the palace was a double-edged sword. The more Xuanzong adored her, the more resentment grew among his soldiers and advisors. They saw her as the reason the empire weakened, and when rebellion finally came, the people demanded her death. Xuanzong, trembling and broken, was forced to choose between his love and his throne. He chose the throne. Yang Gufei was strangled under the shade of a pear tree, the same tree beneath which she had once danced for him. Even after her death, the emperor could never forget her. He built temples in her memory, and poets wrote of his grief for centuries. In the Temps court, passion had become prophecy. One woman's beauty had toppled an empire, but the story of desire didn't end there. As time passed, the emperors who followed tried to control their indulgence. yet they could never escape it. Pleasure had become part of China's political rhythm. The art of the bedchamber was studied like philosophy. Every movement, every breath during intimacy was believed to affect the emperor's spiritual balance. The goal wasn't just satisfaction, it was immortality. Some emperors surrounded themselves with hundreds of women, believing that absorbing their yin energy would strengthen their yang. Imperial physicians recorded every detail: the hours of union, the moon's position, even the emperor's pulse during the act. The emperor's body was considered a vessel of heaven, and pleasure was his divine right. But the more the emperors indulged, the more distant they became from reality. Their palaces became dreamlike prisons, filled with silk curtains, incense smoke, and laughter that hid loneliness. Outside the walls, peasants starved, generals plotted, and corruption spread like a quiet disease. Far to the west, beyond deserts and mountains, another ruler was building his own empire of temptation. In the lands of the Middle East, where religion and royalty often walked hand in hand, the caliphs of the Abbasid dynasty were writing a new chapter in the history of pleasure. In Baghdad, the city of peace, the night was alive with music and poetry. The caliphs built gardens that glittered with lamps, fountains that whispered verses, and halls where dancers moved like flowing silk. Harun al-Rashid, the most famous of them, was set to disguise himself at night to wander the city, listening to the songs of lovers and the cries of the poor. But behind his curiosity lay a hunger for experience, the thrill of desire mixed with danger. His harem was a kingdom of its own. Thousands of women lived within its marble walls. Persian, Greek, Indian, African, each chosen for her unique beauty, each trained to dance, sing, and tell stories. The caliph would spend his nights surrounded by them, yet his heart remained restless. He sought pleasure not from one woman but from the endless variety of them, believing that beauty was the closest thing to divinity. In one tale, it is said Harun fell in love with a slave girl who sang with such sorrow that he freed her instantly, only to realize days later that he couldn't bear to live without her. He searched for her through the markets of Baghdad like a madman. The empire trembled as its most powerful ruler wandered in love's captivity. And yet, this was not weakness. It was humanity. Even the greatest emperors, surrounded by power, wealth, and worship, were helpless before the same emotion that ruled ordinary hearts. But some took that helplessness too far. There were rulers who turned their harems into prisons of pain, where women were punished for disobedience or replaced the moment they lost favor. Others sought new forms of pleasure, darker and more secret. Among the Persian and Ottoman courts, whispers spoke of emperors who invited mystics and alchemists to create potions that could prolong ecstasy, or mirrors enchanted to reflect fantasies. Desire had become an addiction that no empire could control. It crossed from Egypt to Rome, from India to China, from Baghdad to Byzantium, always changing faces but never its nature. It was the invisible empire that outlasted all others, one built not on land or armies, but on longing. And while emperors built palaces of gold to hide their secrets, the world outside was changing. In Europe, new kings were rising. Men who would soon wear crowns not of silk, but of iron. Their kingdoms would not be bathed in incense or poetry, but in the shadow of the church. Yet even there, behind the crosses in cathedrals, lust would find a way. Because no matter how powerful, how pious, or how divine a ruler claimed to be, the throne had one unbreakable curse. It made men believe they could conquer desire, and every time they tried, desire conquered them instead. Europe was waking from the long dream of the ancient empires, but the same fever still burned beneath its marble churches and candlelit palaces. The cross had replaced the sun god, yet desire had not died. It had only learned to whisper in confessionals and hide behind velvet curtains. Kings now ruled not by divine birth, but by divine approval, and that made sin far more thrilling. In France, during the early 12th century, King Philip's court glittered with knights and priests, each pretending holiness while chasing the same forbidden pleasures. But none played the game better than the nobles who surrounded him. They built secret gardens behind the monastery's places, filled with music and wine where monks recited poetry that praised both God and flesh. Even Philip himself was torn between heaven and hunger. He married the pious Ingeborg of Denmark, then abandoned her within days, claiming the marriage cursed him. The church excommunicated him. But the king laughed. His bed was already filled with another woman. The pattern would echo through generations. Kings were expected to embody virtue in public and indulgence in private. In England, Henry II's son, Richard the Lionheart, carried a sword for Christ, yet slept with whoever shared his tent. In the chronicles of the Crusades, knights spoke of holiness by day and temptation by night of sultans. Harems glimpsed through half-open doors, of perfumes from Damascus that clung to their skin like ghosts. When they returned home, they brought with them spices, silks, and new hungers. But it was in the age of chivalry that lust began wearing armor. Courts across Europe created the idea of courtly love, a poetic excuse for adultery. Queens were admired like saints, unattainable and pure, while their admirers wrote verses describing touches that never should have happened. The troubadours sang of love as pain, and knights risked kingdoms for one stolen kiss. Behind those songs lay real stories of queens who plotted with their lovers, of dukes who died for them. In England, Eleanor of Aquitaine was both queen and legend. She had been married to the King of France, then to Henry II of England. Beauty, wit, and fire she had all three. Rumors said that on her way to Jerusalem, she wore armor cut to her shape and rode at the head of her troops like a goddess of war. Men worshipped her, and Henry feared her. When she discovered his affair with a young noblewoman, she raised her sons in rebellion. The war that followed tore the royal family apart, and yet ballads still called her the mother of love. Across the continent, in Spain, the Reconquista raged faith, clashing with desire as Moors and Christians fought for land and souls. But even amid the holy wars, pleasure thrived. Moorish palaces in Granada hid courtyards where fountains murmured beside rose gardens, and the Christian kings who conquered them could not resist copying their beauty. Soon, Spanish castles too were filled with the scent of orange blossoms and the laughter of concubines. The more the church preached purity, the deeper sin buried itself in the palaces. Monks wrote manuals on how to resist temptation, and kings read them with interest but mostly for inspiration. In France, King Louis IX was called the Saint, yet his grandson, Philip IV, would later imprison the Knights Templar on charges that mirrored his own desires. Power and guilt moved in circles, one feeding the other, one hiding behind prayer. Then came the Renaissance, a word that meant rebirth. Though what it truly rebirthed was curiosity, including the forbidden kind. Art returned to the human body. Painters filled cathedrals with saints who looked suspiciously like their lovers. In Florence, Venice, and Rome, the same families who funded the church also funded painters who could capture the blush of a nude shoulder in oil and light. Among these kings, none embodied the contradiction more than Henry VIII of England. He began as the perfect Christian prince, handsome, athletic, and devout. But when desire entered his life in the form of Anne Boleyn, religion became a weapon. He broke from Rome, created his own church, and made himself its headal to divorce one queen and marry another. Yet one son lost the charm of novelty. He accused her of adultery and sent her to the scaffold. The crowd watched as the blade fell, and Henry wiped his tears with silk. He would go on to marry 6 times, each union beginning with passion and ending in fear. Europe learned a new truth. Through Henry, that lust could split an entire faith. The Protestant Reformation was not born of love, but it was sparked by one man's refusal to control it. In the years that followed, kings used religion as camouflage, ruling in the name of God while chasing the same earthly cravings that had undone empires before them. In France, centuries later, the Bourbon kings perfected the art of hidden decadence. Louis XIV built Versailles, not merely as a symbol of power, but as a stage for desire. Mirrors lined its holes so that beauty could admire itself endlessly. Courtiers whispered. Lovers vanished behind gold doors, and every dance was a secret declaration. Louis kept mistresses, as other men kept books, cataloged by charm, wit, and danger. Yet he believed his passion divine, calling himself the Sun King, as if light itself obeyed his whims. Even after his death, the pattern continued. Louis XV inherited both the throne and the hunger. He filled his private quarters with women chosen from every corner of France. Madame de Pompadour, his most famous mistress, ruled the court with painted lips and iron will, using beauty as politics and pleasure as diplomacy. Ministers bowed to her. Poets wrote in her honor. The kingdom glittered while the poor starved outside the gates. By the time Louis XVI came to power, the disease of indulgence had hollowed the monarchy from within. The people no longer whispered, they shouted. The revolution erupted, and the palaces of pleasure became prisons. Heads fell where kisses once landed, and the scent of perfume was replaced by gunpowder. The guillotine ended what centuries of temptation had begun. Yet, even as blood darkened the cobblestones, desire survived. It always did. It merely changed its disguise from the silken bedchamber to the salons of the New World. From royal decrees to secret letters, the kings were gone, but their legacy lived in the way people still confused power with love. And somewhere beyond Europe, in the deserts of Arabia and the jungles of Africa, other rulers watched the fall of the West and smiled. They too had their secrets, their hidden queens, their chambers of gold. The world was vast, but the story remained the same. The higher the throne, the deeper the sin it tried to hide. The death of Elagabalus left Rome trembling between relief and disgust. The Senate tried to erase his name, burn his portraits, and pretend such shame had never touched the empire. The memories lingered like perfume spilled on stone, and behind the marble faces of new emperors, the same hunger kept pulsing, quieter now, but never gone. It hid behind politics, behind religion, behind the image of divine rulers pretending to be pure. But behind those masks, the dance of power and pleasure only grew more twisted. Centuries passed, and while Rome faded, the East burned brighter than ever. The Byzantine Empire, the so-called Christian era of Rome, cloaked itself in piety. But behind the golden icons and whispered prayers, emperors and empresses were writing their own secret histories of lust. Among them was one woman who would change the world with both her ambition and her body. Theodora. Before she became empress, Theodora was nothing. An orphan, a performer, and a prostitute in the dark corners of Constantinople's theater district. Men came to see her perform unspeakable acts on stage, wrapped in nothing but jewels. But what no one saw was her sharp mind, her hunger for power, and her refusal to stay at the bottom of the empire. She used her beauty like a weapon, and her laughter became her armor. One night, a rising general named Justinian saw her perform. He was older, stern, and ambitious, but something about her made him tremble. To everyone's shock, he brought her to the palace. The priests protested, the senators mocked him, but Justinian didn't care. He married her, made her his queen, and together they ruled the Byzantine Empire with an iron hand wrapped in silk. To the world, they were the perfect imperial couple, wise, godly, chosen by heaven. But behind the thick curtains of their palace, their nights were full of fire. Theodora was not just beautiful, she was dominant, ruthless, and manipulative. She once told Justinian, "Power is not given, it's taken," and she took it in every sense. She influenced his laws, shaped his wars, and bent the court to her will. Some said she demanded nightly ceremonies of submission, not from slaves, but from senators. The men who once mocked her now crawled at her feet, their power stripped away in more ways than one. Rumors spread that Theodora maintained her own private chambers, where she entertained nobles, generals, even priests, not for love, but for leverage. She turned pleasure into politics. If Caligula used lust for chaos, Theodora used it for control. When one bishop dared to question her morality, she reminded him in front of the entire court that God forgives, but the empress remembers. The man was found dead days later, his body dumped in the Bosphorus. Justinian, for all his power, was helplessly devoted to her. When a revolt broke out in Constantinople and his generals urged him to flee, Theodora refused. "Purple makes a fine burial shroud," she said, meaning she would rather die as an empress than live as a coward. Her courage silenced everyone. The rebellion was crushed, and their rule became unshakable. But even after her death, whispers of her secret desires never died. She had risen from the gutters to the throne, and she had taken the world by storm, body and soul. While Theodora's legend burned in the East, the West had its own demons to feed. In France, centuries later, another royal figure would embody the same hunger, cloaked in gold. King Charles, sixth known as Charles the Mad. His reign was one of chaos and fear. One moment he would kneel before the altar, weeping for forgiveness. The next, he would rip off his clothes, claiming to be made of glass and screaming that no one should touch him. But it wasn't just madness that defined him, it was the madness of his court. The Queen Isabeau of Bavaria was said to be one of the most beautiful women in Europe, but beauty in the palace was poison. When Charles' mind began to crumble, Isabeau filled the void. She took lovers openly, nobles, guards, even priests, and her chambers became the heart of Parisian scandal. The people whispered that her bedchamber had two doors, one for the king and one for everyone else. She was seen laughing during mass, playing with her rosary while her lover knelt beside her disguised as a servant. But there was one story that spread like wildfire. During a royal masquerade, Charles and his friends dressed as wild men covered in pitch and feathers. A dangerous game. A spark caught, and the room went up in flames. While courtiers screamed, Queen Isabeau stood frozen, watching her husband burn. Some said she smiled. Whether true or not, it marked the end of Charles' sanity and the beginning of her quiet reign from the shadows. She ruled not through armies, but through seduction. Ministers who opposed her were suddenly seen leaving her rooms in shame. Foreign envoys returned home singing her praises. Even her own son grew to hate her, claiming she had sold France to sin. When idiot, her coffin was guarded day and night, not to honor her, but to ensure no one desecrated her body. But across the Mediterranean, another queen was rewriting the meaning of desire, one whose name still glows in gold and sin. Cleopatra, though centuries separated her from Theodora and Isabeau, her legend stood above them all. She wasn't merely beautiful, she was intoxicating. Every gesture, every word, was a spell. Julius Caesar fell under it. Then, Mark Antony. But what history often forgets is that Cleopatra's seduction was not just for pleasure. It was strategy, survival. Her nights with Caesar were filled with more than passion. Between whispers and kisses, she secured Egypt's future. She knew Rome's men were weak, not for her body, but for her brilliance. Yet her love with Antony was different. Dangerous, defiant. They turned love into war, their alliance shaking empires. When Octavian's army surrounded them, they chose death together rather than surrender. Even their suicides became theater. She with the serpent, he with the sword. History called it tragedy, but Cleopatra would have called it victory. She lived and died as she wanted. Queen, lover, goddess. The empires changed, religions rose and fell, but the pattern never did. Kings and queens, bound by gold, driven by hunger each, believing themselves divine, untouchable. Yet their thrones were built on the same desires that ruled every mortal heart. And as time marched forward, those desires found new masks: silk, velvet, crowns, and prayers. But behind them, the same fire still burned, and in that fire, the next empire was waiting to rise. The world that rose after Cleopatra was different, colder, more organized, yet no less hungry. Empires that once fought with swords, now fought with symbols, with churches and creeds, with sanctity as their shield. Yet beneath those cathedrals and golden crosses, the same forbidden whispers flowed through corridors scented with incense and sin. Power had simply changed its costume, and nowhere was that more evident than in the Vatican itself, where men sworn to chastity built a palace of lust. The Renaissance, an age of art, of genius, of beauty, was also an age of hypocrisy. Behind every fresco of angels, there was a sinner holding the brush. Behind every holy decree, there was a bargain sealed in bed. And at the center of it all was the Borgia family, led by the man who called himself the Vicar of Christ, Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia. He rose through the ranks of the church, not through faith, but through cunning. He bribed, threatened, seduced, and when he finally wore the papal crown, Rome gasped. For the first time, sin itself sat on the throne of God. Rodrigo was a man of appetites, gold, power, and flesh. He filled the papal palace with feasts, musicians, and lovers. The air was heavy with perfume and corruption. Priests danced with courtesans. Wine flowed like blood, but among all his indulgences, one name eclipsed the rest: his daughter, Lucrezia Borgia. To the outside world, she was the symbol of purity. Blonde hair, angelic face, soft smile. Yet those who entered her chambers whispered of a different truth. They said her beauty was a trap, a weapon her father wielded to destroy his enemies. Princes, cardinals, and dukes all fell under her spell, one after another. Tabanisi poisoned, exiled, or disgraced. Some said Lucretia carried a hollow ring filled with arsenic, but she could smile while killing. Others said her relationships went far beyond the bounds of decency, even into her own family. Rodrigo, her father, was said to adore her too deeply. Her brother, Cesare Borgia, watched her too closely. The three of them, bound by blood and sin, ruled Rome like a dark trinity. Their family dinners filled with laughter, politics, and something unholy simmering beneath. One night, they hosted what history would later call the Banquet of Chestnuts. 50 courtesans danced naked in the Vatican halls while the Pope watched, cheering as his guests threw chestnuts across the marble floor. The women crawled after them, their bodies glistening in candlelight. Rodrigo laughed, Lucrezia smiled, and Cesare whispered names of the nobles who would soon die. To the world, they were monsters. But to those who understood power, the Borgias were visionaries. They ruled not with armies, but with desire. They turned seduction into strategy. Their enemies might have had soldiers, but the Borgias had the one weapon no one could resist: temptation. And yet, every flame consumes itself. Rodrigo died gasping, poisoned by his own cup. Cesar's body was found in a field, stripped of armor, his face eaten by wolves. Lucrezia, left alone, spent her last years in prayer, or pretending to pray. Some say her final confession lasted 3 days. Others say she smiled as she died, as if remembering the world she once controlled with a kiss. But lust didn't die with them. It only crossed the sea. In the courts of England and France, kings cloaked in holiness carried the same darkness within. Henry VIII, for instance, saw himself as God as a chosen ruler. Until God became inconvenient. He had 6 wives, but his heart and his sin belonged to his desire. When the church refused to grant him a divorce, he broke from Rome and created his own religion. He didn't just change his marriage, he changed history. Henry's palace was filled with secrets chambers, where queens wept and courtiers whispered. Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom he defied the Pope, was his greatest obsession. He risked everything to have her his crown, his soul, his empire. But obsession is a blade that cuts both ways. Once she was his, he grew bored. Her laughter began to irritate him. Her sharp wit turned to poison. Soon, the same lips he once kissed were accused of treason, witchcraft, even incest. Henry watched her execution from a window, his face blank as her head fell. That night, they said he dined with another woman. His next queen, he was no longer just a king. He was a god in his own eyes. Every marriage, every death, every bed he shared was another decree written in lust and blood. He married again and again, his heart never full, his power never satisfied. By the end of his reign, his body had rotted from within: ulcers, disease, decay. A living mirror of the corruption he'd sown. But England's madness didn't stop there. After Henry came his daughter, Elizabeth I, known as the Virgin Queen. She ruled with grace and iron. Yet even she had her secrets. Courtiers whispered of late-night meetings, of locked doors and muffled laughter. She denied all rumors, claiming purity. But her portraits told another story. A woman who knew exactly how to wield a loop. She understood what her father never did, that the suggestion of desire can be more powerful than desire itself. While Europe's thrones tangled love and power, far across the seas, in the Mughal Empire, another kind of passion ruled, one carved in marble and blood. Emperor Henry Akbar was consumed by his love for Noor Jahan, a woman so intelligent and seductive that she reshaped an empire from behind the veil. She was both poet and strategist, warrior and temptress. Jahangir built her palaces, gave her coins with her face engraved beside his, and let her rule in his name. But the court hated her power. They called her witch, manipulator, sorceress. She didn't care. When enemies plotted against her husband, she rode out in armor, leading soldiers into battle. When Jahangir was drunk, she signed royal decree. She ruled through devotion and through her ability to control his every heartbeat. Some said she whispered commands in bed and sealed treaties with Kia. And when he died, she built his tomb with her own hands. A monument to love and domination both. History remembers emperors as conquerors, but so often it was the whispers in their beds that truly shaped empires. Wars were planned in silk sheets, kingdoms traded for embraces, and legacies written with the ink of desire. The same hunger that burned in Rome and Byzantium now burned in Delhi, in London, in Paris, eternal, undying. The world moved forward, but lust never looked back. And as the age of kings began to fade, the next chapter of desire was already taking shape, one that would belong not to emperors, but to revolutionaries who believed themselves free of sin, but carried it just as deep. The age of kings was ending, but the age of indulgence was far from over. The world was changing. Science was replacing superstition. Revolutions were replacing monarchs, and reason was supposed to conquer desire. But history laughs at reason, because while the world marched toward enlightenment, the same darkness crept behind silk curtains, inside candlelit rooms, beneath powdered wigs and polite smiles. And nowhere did that contrast shine brighter than in the palaces of 18th century France. King Louis XV of France was called the Beloved, at least at first. When he ascended the throne, he was handsome, intelligent, and full of charm. The people loved him, calling him a blessing after years of war and hunger. But as power settled on his shoulders, so did boredom. The weight of the crown made him restless. He found no joy in politics, no thrill in battle, only in pleasure. The Palace of Versailles became a kingdom of desire, and Louis its willing prisoner. At first, it was discreet. A mistress here, a noble woman there. But soon, the whispers grew. He built a secret mansion, Parco serfs, just minutes from the palace, a hidden paradise where he housed dozens of young women. They were carefully chosen by royal agents, sometimes as young as 15, bathed in perfume, dressed in silk, and trained in etiquette. They were told they were serving France by serving the king. At night, carriages would quietly roll into the back gates. The lamps dimmed, the air heavy with wine and music. Louis would arrive wearing a mask, pretending to be a man and not a god, losing himself in the illusions he had built. Some say he wanted to forget the throne entirely, to be loved not as a king, but as a man. But in truth, even his desire was imperial. He controlled every kiss, every sigh, every secret. Among his lovers, one would rise above the rest. Hian Anton Poisson, known to history as Madame de Pan. She was not born noble. She was clever, witty, beautiful, and ambitious. She didn't just please Louis, she understood him. Where others offered beauty, she offered brilliance. She became his confidant, advisor, decorator, even political strategist. Ministers came to her chambers before they went to his, but even Pompadour knew the limits of her power. After years as his mistress, she lost the king's physical interest, yet she stayed in his heart and his court. To keep her position, she filled his palace with diversions, theater, banquets, masquerades, each more extravagant than the last. The country was bleeding money, peasants starved, but Versailles glittered. Pleasure had become policy. When Pompadour died, Louis was heartbroken for a week, and then the parade of women resumed. The nobles whispered that the king's lust had become a sickness. Priests warned that God's patience was running out. But Louis didn't care. He had lived too long as a slave to pleasure to ever repent. Ironically, the same kingdom that had adored him now began to rot under his reign. When he died, the people no longer called him the Beloved. They called him the Corrupt. And then came his grandson, Louis XVI, and with him, the woman who would become the face of royal excess, Marie Antoinette. She was only 14 when she was sent from Austria to marry him. Barely understanding the language of the throne she was stepping onto, Louis XVI was awkward. shy, and disinterested in her. Nights passed in silence. Their marriage went unconsummated for years. Alone in the golden prison of Versailles, Marie turned to fashion, gambling, and luxury for comfort. She built her own private palace, the Petit Trianon, where she played shepherdess, dressed in silk ruffles, and surrounded herself with musicians and lovers. The people began to whisper again. "If the peasants have no bread," someone claimed, she said, "let them eat cake." Whether true or not, it didn't matter. To the starving masses, she became the symbol of everything obscene and heartless about royalty. Behind her charm and her diamonds, though, was a loneliness no crown could cure. Her rumored affairs, especially with Count Fairson, a dashing Swedish noble, gave her the affection her husband could not. Their letters, filled with longing and coded phrases, survived centuries of censorship. "I love you madly," she wrote once, "and nothing can destroy that." But love could not save her. The revolution came for her, and for every sin Versailles had ever committed. When the guillotine fell on her neck, the crowd cheered. Her blood, they believed, washed away centuries of indulgence. But history is a cruel trickster, because even revolutions born in virtue often rot in the same old vices. In the new France of liberty, men like Napoleon Bonaparte would rise, claiming to be saviors, yet no less human in their desires. Napoleon was brilliant, ruthless, and insatiable. He conquered nations, crowned himself emperor, and bent Europe to his will. But even as he dictated the fate of millions, his heart, or perhaps his weakness, belonged to one woman, Josephine de Beauharnais. She was older, elegant, experienced everything he wasn't when they met. Her scent, her laughter, her charm intoxicated him. He wrote her letters from battlefields filled with desperation and lust. "A kiss on your heart," he wrote, "1,000 on your lips." When he returned from war, she greeted him with warmth and the scent of another man. Napoleon was shattered, yet he couldn't let her go. Even after divorcing Josephine to marry a younger princess for political gain, he kept her portrait beside his bed. In his final days on St. Helena, exiled and broken, he whispered her name with his last breath. For all his glory, he died like every man who ever loved a deeply defeated, not by empires, but by the heart. Meanwhile, across the Channel, England was living its own quiet decadence. The Victorian era, famous for its moral strictness, was one of the most hypocritical in history. While public virtue was preached from every pulpit, private vice thrived in drawing rooms, theaters, and brothels. Even Queen Victoria herself, the symbol of restraint, was a woman of deep passion. After marrying Prince Albert, their love letters revealed an intensity that shocked historians. She wrote of her desire, her jealousy, her joy, emotions carefully erased from her public image. But outside the palace, the streets of London told another story. Gentlemen in fine coats visited secret clubs. Actresses became mistresses of lords. And the same city that banned open talk of sex ran on its hidden currency. The upper class called it civility. The lower class called it survival. By now, the empires of old had crumbled. Thrones had fallen. Revolutions had come and gone. But lust, that ancient, eternal ruler, still sat unchallenged. It wore new clothes now. Powder-eyed wigs, polished manners, polished hypocrisy. Kings no longer claimed to be gods, yet they still believed they could rewrite morality. And as the 19th century drew to a close, the world was standing on the edge of a new age. Industrial, modern, enlightened. But even the steam engines and factories could not silence the whispers that had followed mankind since the first throne was built. Because, in the shadows of progress, in the corners of every palace and parliament, desire was still alive, waiting, patient, timeless. And the next century would prove that no matter how modern the world became, the oldest sin of all would never die. By the time the 20th century dawned, the world believed it had finally outgrown its kings, its empires, and its ancient vices. Science ruled where superstition once stood. Democracy replaced divine right, and men now crowned themselves not with gold, but with ambition. Yet even as the lights of the modern age flickered to life, shadows still clung to its corners. Because while the thrones of the past had crumbled, the hunger that had driven them, the lust for power, flesh, and control had simply found new faces. In Vienna, a young Sigmund Freud was unlocking the mysteries of the human mind. His theories of desire, repression, and forbidden impulses shocked society. But while intellectuals debated his ideas in smoke-filled cafes, the same elite who called his work scandalous lived out every secret fantasy he described. Behind the velvet curtains of the Austro-Hungarian court, decadence still ruled. Archdukes, duchesses, and officers held masked balls where anything could happen, and often did. One such figure was Archduke Ludwig Victor, the brother of Emperor Franz Joseph. Handsome, charming, and utterly unrestrained, he was notorious for his affairs with men. Vienna was shocked, yet fascinated. He hosted secret gatherings filled with champagne and candlelight, inviting artists, actors, and soldiers. For him, power was pleasure, and pleasure was power. His scandal eventually forced his exile. But his story revealed what the world refused to admit, that behind every mask of civility, the old instincts never died. Meanwhile, across Europe, a new empire was being born, one that would carry both elegance and sin to its highest peaks. The British Empire. Its rulers were not just monarchs, but icons, and none embodied that more than King Edward VII, son of Queen Victoria, a man who turned the throne into a playground. Edward, known as Bertie, had spent his youth suffocating under his mother's strict morality. When he finally became king, he exploded into indulgence. Paris was his paradise, its theaters, restaurants, and salons alive with music, perfume, and temptation. He was a frequent guest at Maxim's, the city's most luxurious cabaret, where courtesans whispered his name like a prayer. He was infamous for his mistresses, most notably Alice Capel, the great-grandmother of Camilla, the current Queen of England. Their affair lasted decades, and she had more influence over the king than his ministers. During state meetings, Edward would often take breaks to see her. When he died, she was at his bedside, the final symbol of a life ruled by passion, not politics. The hypocrisy was staggering. England preached restraint to its colonies, yet its king was a living embodiment of indulgence. The empire was vast, its power unmatched, yet its ruler was undone by the same hunger that had consumed the emperors of old. History had come full circle, just dressed in better clothes. But if Edward's pleasures were personal, others in the 20th century turned lust into politics, and politics into lust. Adolf Hitler, despite his image of cold control, was surrounded by an aura of obsessive sexuality. His relationship with Eva Braun was secret, forbidden by his own design. He wanted to be adored by millions, not tied to one. But behind closed doors, he was consumed by control over her, over everyone. Eva's diary hinted at loneliness, submission, and devotion that bordered on worship. Their love story was less about affection and more about possession. The same twisted dynamic that defined his rule. Around him, his offices mirrored his corruption. Hermann Hay, rind-draped in silks and jewels, held opulent feasts while Europe burned. Joseph Goebbels, master of propaganda, kept mistresses hidden behind his family portraits. Even Heinrich Himmler, architect of terror, preached purity by day and sought indulgence by night. The Nazi regime wasn't just political tyranny, it was moral perversion on an industrial scale. The same lust that had once destroyed kings now destroyed nations. And when the war ended, the illusion of purity shattered. The victors were not saints either. In the post-war years, political power and sexual scandal became inseparable. John F. Kennedy, the charming, youthful president of the United States, became a modern myth. To the public, it was a hero. To those who knew him, he was a man haunted by restlessness. His affairs with actresses, interns, and socialites became legend. Marilyn Monroe's breathy, "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" was not just a song, it was a symbol of power entwined with desire. Kennedy's enemies painted him as immoral. His admirers called him human. But in truth, he was simply part of an ancient pattern. Another ruler caught between love, duty, and lust. Even his death, sudden and violent, carried echoes of past tragedies, reminding the world that power and vulnerability always walk hand in hand. Across the Atlantic, Europe was rebuilding. but its new leaders carried old flaws. Italy's Prime Minister, Silvio Berlusconi, hosted bunga-bunga parties filled with models and dancers, mixing politics and pleasure so shamelessly that even Rome's emperors might have blushed. In England, royal scandals resurfaced, from Princess Margaret's forbidden love to Prince Charles' own affair that would one day rewrite the monarchy's story. And yet, despite the outrage, fascination never faded. Humanity's obsession with the forbidden remained unbroken. Newspapers replaced court gossip. Paparazzi replaced royal spies, but the stories were the same. Kings and queens, presidents and prime ministers, all falling to the same desire that had undone their ancestors. Even Hollywood, the new empire of the world, became a modern Versailles. The stars were its royalty, their scandals its entertainment. The casting couch replaced the royal bedchamber, but the game was unchanged power. Seducing beauty, manipulating power. The same ancient script, rewritten under brighter lights. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the old thrones were mostly gone, but the hunger remained. Only now it lived inside every man and woman with a screen, a secret, and a chance to feel like a king. Technology made sin faster, quieter, more intimate. Scandal became currency. Privacy died, but temptation flourished. If Caligula had ruled with madness, and Cleopatra with charm, the rulers of today reigned with illusion, crafting digital palaces where desire never slept. Power had left the castles, but it hadn't left the human heart. It simply changed form, from crowns to cameras, from thrones to profiles, from whispers in corridors to messages on glowing screens. And somewhere in that endless loop of power and passion, the same story kept repeating, proof that no matter how far civilization traveled, it could never escape the pulse that had shaped it from the very beginning. Because history was never just about wars and treaties. It was about the nights between them, the secrets whispered in bed, the forbidden desires that toppled empires and built new ones. And as the modern world looked into the mirror of its past, it would see the same reflection staring back. A reflection crowned not in gold, but in sin. The whispers around the Mughal harem had become songs of both beauty and terror. It was said that Emperor Jahangir, the son of Akbar, had inherited not his father's wisdom, but his love for intoxication and women. His palace was a labyrinth of silk curtains, marble fontaines, and perfumed bodies that moved like shadows in the night. Every evening, the sound of anklets echoed through the corridors, announcing yet another feast of pleasure, one that the emperor barely remembered the next morning. But Jahangir's obsessions weren't just for women. They extended to the art of possession. He believed that love was only real when it was conquered. The emperor would often disguise himself and wander through the bazaars of Delhi, searching for beauty hidden among commoners. There are tales of him falling for a dancer, her face veiled and her laughter wild. But when she refused his advances, he ordered her to perform in the court, and when she danced before him, trembling, he whispered to his guards, "Let her dance for eternity." She was never seen again. His addiction to wine and pleasure made him a weak ruler, but it was his wife Nur Jahan who truly ruled the empire. She was intelligent, strategic, and equally cunning. Where Jahangir sought physical indulgence, Nur Jahan sought power. Together, they became a dangerous pair. The emperor's lust and the empress's ambition, feeding off each other like twin fires. Behind their silk curtains, they made and destroyed kings, generals, and lovers with whispers and glances. And yet even in her control, Nur Jahan was not immune to the poison of seduction. There were rumors that she too kept secret company with the young soldiers she favored, cloaking her indulgence under the excuse of loyalty. Far to the west, in the Ottoman Empire, another storm of passion brewed behind the domes of Sultan Ibrahim, known to history as Ibrahim. The Mad turned his empire's harem into a theater of insanity. He had been locked in a cage for most of his youth by his paranoid brother, and when he finally ascended the throne, years of suppressed desire exploded in uncontrollable obsession. He ordered his officials to search the entire empire for the most beautiful women, hundreds of them, to fill his palace. But his madness didn't stop there. He had a bizarre fascination with scents and textures. He would make his concubines cover themselves in honey and roll in gold dust, or wear furs from exotic beasts. One day, he was said to have fallen in love with a cow, believing her to be a reincarnated woman from his dreams. His advisors couldn't accustom him. Those who mocked his madness were executed. The harem became a place of laughter that hid tears, pleasure that hid pain. Yet the most shocking act came when Ibrahim, in a fit of jealousy, ordered the drowning of 280 women from his harem because he suspected one of them had slept with another man. The Bosphorus waters carried away the lifeless bodies that night, while the city fell silent under the moonlight. His lust had consumed reason, and soon after, his own ministers conspired to strangle him in his sleep. Lust had now become something more than personal pleasure. It was a mirror reflecting the sickness of absolute power. The emperors who ruled from their golden thrones believed they owned everything: lands, lives, and even love. And yet, they were slaves to their own desires. In Persia, the Safavid ruler Shah Abbas the Great tried to control this very temptation. He had seen what unchecked lust did to rulers, and so he tried to regulate it. But even he could not resist its lure. Abbas loved young men and boys, often taking his pages as lovers. His palace became a place of beauty and art, but behind the tapestries and gardens, forbidden relationships thrived. His actions were carefully hidden behind a curtain of poetry and mysticism, for to the world he was the pious guardian of faith. Yet his nights were filled with forbidden pleasure and whispered names that would never be recorded in history. Baek in China, the Ming dynasty's emperors were no different. The Wanli emperor, who ruled during the late 1500s, abandoned his duties entirely for the sake of a single concubine. She was beautiful, mysterious, and manipulative, and through her, he ignored his ministers, his generals, even his people. The Forbidden City became a place of forgotten laws and endless nights. Servants would carry trays of wine into the emperor's chamber, but no one dared enter until the morning. The empire began to rot, while the emperor chased love in silken darkness. Even the great Emperor Nero of Rome, centuries before, had done something similar, marrying a young boy named Sporus, after having him castrated and dressed as a woman. He paraded him in public as his wife, kissing him before crowds, demanding everyone address him as empress. The line between love and madness, between ruler and captive, blurred into something the world had never seen before. As the centuries turned, these stories crossed borders and empires, carried by travelers and historians who could barely believe what they heard. They whispered that power and pleasure were twins born together, dying together. Every time an emperor reached for immortality, his hands were stained with both blood and lust. By the time the Renaissance dawned in Europe, a new kind of ruler had emerged: kings and queens who hid their desires behind religion, art, and politics. But make no mistake, the sickness still lived on, only more elegantly dressed. Behind the velvet curtains of French palaces and the candlelit halls of England, the same desires burned as fiercely as ever. And somewhere in those flickering lights, Historia's most scandalous ruler was preparing to take the throne, a king whose love life would shake the foundation of an entire nation and change religion itself. By the time the world stepped into the Renaissance, the marble palaces of ancient Rome and the desert harems of the East had turned into candlelit courts of Europe. But the heartbeat of lust, power, and obsession remained the same. Only the setting had changed. Behind the perfume of roses and the sound of violins, the same shadows moved: queens with whispered lovers, kings with secret chambers, and priests pretending not to see. In England, the most famous of them all was a man who believed that God himself had chosen him to rule, King Henry VIII. To the world, he was majestic, tall, and commanding, the very image of divine authority. But beneath his royal robes was a man consumed by desire. He wanted love, but not the kind that ends in peace. He wanted possession, dominance, and legacy. His obsession with producing a male heir became the excuse for his lust to spiral into tyranny. It began with Anne Boleyn. She wasn't the most beautiful woman in England, but she was clever, confident, and daring, and that was enough to trap the king's heart. Henry's passion for her burned so fiercely that he tore apart an entire religion just to have her. He broke from the Catholic Church, declared himself head of the Church of England, and married Anne. For a moment, he had everything: power, love, and defiance. But when Anne failed to give him a son, the same desire that had built her throne turned into the blade that took her head. Henry's court became a stage where love was a performance and lust was politics. He married 6 times, each wife representing a different phase of his obsession, from infatuation to disappointment to cruelty. His appetite could not be satisfied, not by beauty, nor loyalty, nor faith. He was a man who wanted control, not companionship. In the end, he grew obese and paranoid, surrounded by ghosts of the women he had destroyed. The empire he built in lust eventually rotted from within. Across Europe, another monarch was rewriting the meaning of indulgence, but this time it was a queen. In Russia, Catherine the Great ruled with an iron hand and a heart that refused to be caged. Married to the weak and childish Peter III, Catherine soon realized that to save Russia, she had to take power, and to satisfy her heart, she needed lovers. Many of them. Catherine's list of lovers became the talk of every court in Europe. Diplomats whispered that she chose her favorites like one would choose generals young, strong, and loyal. Yet Catherine wasn't just a woman lost in lust. She was a strategist. Her lovers were often her allies, men who helped her strengthen her empire. Her bed was her battlefield, and her charm was her sword. While poets wrote of her beauty, her enemies feared her cunning, but the rumors were cruel. They called her insatiable, accused her of impossible acts, and turned her legacy into scandal. The stories of her supposed affairs with guards, nobles, and even animals were born not from truth, but from jealousy, from men who could not stand the sight of a woman ruling like a god. Catherine's private life became the easiest weapon against her public greatness. And yet, she ruled for over 30 years, one of the most powerful monarchs in history, her empire expanding while her legend burned brighter than ever. Farther west, in France, the royal palaces shimmered with beauty and sin. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, filled Versailles with mirrors, silk, and women. His life was a constant festival of power and pleasure. His mistresses were not hidden. They were part of his court, elegant, dangerous, and fiercely competitive. The palace became a city of desire, where beauty could open doors and a single glance could destroy reputations. Louis's lovers often wielded more influence than ministers, deciding wars and alliances from the warmth of his bed. The same pattern repeated itself through the centuries. In Spain, in Italy, in the Ottoman courts, kings and emperors built their worlds around lust, disguised as love, and devotion, disguised as control. They were men who could conquer continents, but not themselves. And yet, not every story was one of cruelty. Some rulers, in their search for passion, discovered vulnerability, the one emotion power could never provide. Emperor Akbar of India, for example, though surrounded by wives and concubines, found true companionship in a Rajput princess, Jodhabai. Their love was not of lust, but of understanding, a rare spark of humanity in a world built on dominance. But such stories were rare. Most of history's thrones were soaked in desire, where kings treated hearts as trophies, and queens turned seduction into survival. Every night, in those candlelit chambers, behind the laughter, the wine, and the whispered promises, there was always a silent truth. Power and passion were never separate. They were two faces of the same empire. From Nero to Henry, from Cleopatra to Catherine. Every ruler believed they could control love the same way they controlled their nations. But love, or the hunger mistaken for it, was never meant to be ruled. It ruled them instead. As centuries passed, the world began to judge less harshly. The scandals of the past became stories, the rumors became legends, and the lust of emperors became the curiosity of history. Yet the pattern never truly disappeared. Modern power still seduces, and modern rulers still fall to the same ancient weaknesses. Only the walls have changed, from marble to glass, and the scandals from whispers to headlines. Perhaps that's the greatest secret of all, that behind every crown, whether of gold or democracy, there still beats the same human heart, restless and craving. History may have evolved, but the desires that shaped empires still live on in quiet rooms and closed doors. And as the echoes of those ancient chambers fade, one truth remains carved into time. Empires may rise on power, but they fall to passion.